Before I tell you what happened at Scarif Station, I need you to understand something about the way our tacticians modeled the engagement. They ran the simulation 412 times. 412 times, the humans lost. Not narrowly. Not heroically. Plus, they lost the way a fire loses to vacuum. Completely, without drama, without remainder. The Veth Dominion's eastern flank outnumbered them 6-1. Their ammunition resupply had been cut off for 11 days. 3 of their forward positions had already been overrun. Our analysts, and these were not careless people, these were the finest strategic minds the Scarif Observation Corps had ever trained, filed a joint report that used the phrase statistically unrecoverable for separate times. I remember reading that report, which I remember thinking, yes, this is accurate. This is what the numbers say. I'm recording this because I was wrong, and someone needs to say that out loud. My name, is Field Observer 3rd Rank Desig Vaughn, assigned to Neutral Monitoring Post Curl 7, and I watched what happened next through a sensor array that cost more than most planetary defense budgets. I'd good coffee that morning, real pressed grain, not the recycled slurry they serve at the forward posts. On my log, stylus tapping against my left knee the way it always does when I'm certain about something. I was certain the humans were finished, which I need you to understand that certainty. Hold it. Feel how solid it was. Because what I'm about to describe is what happened when the humans found out we thought they were finished and decided that was the funniest thing they'd heard all week. The first thing I logged that morning was 0614 standard, Eastern Corridor heat signature anomaly. Actually, possible equipment malfunction. Flagging for review. Log everything with timestamps. It's a habit my supervisor calls compulsive, and I call professional, and we've been having that argument for 6 years without resolution. The point is, everything that happened at Scarif Station exists in my records down to the half second, and I can tell you precisely when things stopped making sense. It was 0631. That was when the humans moved in the wrong direction. Let me back up. The tactical situation at Scarif Station had developed over 3 weeks of grinding, brutal attrition that I'd been observing from Curl 7's boost sensor suite. Honestly, close enough for full resolution imaging, far enough that nobody would shoot at me, which is exactly how I prefer my posting assignments. The Veth Dominion had pushed through the outer Scarif perimeter 11 days prior, cutting the human contingent of the Federated Response Force off from their primary supply lines. What remained was approximately 230 human soldiers. I cross-referenced the number 4 times. I'm thorough, dug into a series of connected structures near the station's processing core. The Veth had 6 times that number. Fresh troops, functional supply chains, and the kind of institutional confidence that comes from never having lost a major engagement in 2 centuries of recorded conflict. Our analysts had modeled the endgame. 11, I think, days without resupply against that kind of weight in those conditions. The conclusion wasn't complicated. Attrition would resolve the situation within 72 hours, possibly less. What nobody modeled was what the humans would do with the 11 days they'd already survived. I found out at 0631 when I watched a small group, 7 individuals, I counted them twice, move not toward their defensive perimeter, not toward any of the 3 remaining viable escape corridors that our analysts had identified, but toward the heaviest Veth concentration on the eastern flank, through territory that had been Veth-controlled for 9 days, without any apparent support, carrying what my sensors identified as a collection of equipment that didn't correspond to any standard Federated military loadout I'd on file. I tapped my log stylus against my knee 17 times in a row before I noticed I was doing it. Curl 7 log, I said, voice going a little flat the way it does when I'm improvising, 0631. 7 human personnel, unidentified equipment, advancing on Veth Eastern Cluster. Reason, unclear, flagging as priority observation. I leaned forward in my chair and increased the sensor resolution. The human in front, short by human standards, which meant nothing, they're all enormous, was carrying something over one shoulder that looked like it had been assembled from 3 separate pieces of incompatible equipment and held together with physical fasteners. Beside her, a taller one was consulting what appeared to be a hand-drawn diagram on a surface that wasn't any kind of standard interface I recognized. They were not running. They were not moving with the low, fast efficiency I associated with Federated soldiers in a tactical approach. They were moving like people who had somewhere to be and weren't particularly worried about the timeline. One of them, the third from the left, appeared to be eating something. I logged 0633. Human personnel maintained steady pace. No tactical urgency observed. Plus, one individual consuming nutrition during approach. Query: is this normal? I didn't have an answer for that. I flagged it and kept watching. The Veth kind of eastern cluster was garrisoned by approximately 90 soldiers positioned around two heavy shield emitters that projected overlapping fields covering the main approach corridor. Standard Veth defensive doctrine, the kind of layered, interlocking coverage that made direct assault prohibitively expensive. Our analysts had noted these emitters in particular in their assessment. Eastern approach effectively sealed. Human forces lacked sufficient anti-shield capacity to breach within viable time frame. The 7 humans stopped approximately 400 meters from the outer sensor perimeter of the Veth position. In a burned-out section of the station's outer service corridor that offered concealment, but no real cover from directed energy weapons. The short one in front crouched down and put the assembled equipment thing on the ground. The one with, I guess, the hand-drawn diagram crouched beside her. They appeared to be having a quiet conversation. The one who'd been eating finished whatever it was, tucked the container somewhere inside their gear, and then lay down flat on the ground, which struck me as a statistically inadvisable thing to do 45 seconds from a Veth sensor perimeter. Except he didn't seem to be resting. Plus, he had something in his hands. Long, narrow, the kind of elongated geometry that made my tactical pattern recognition fire off several overlapping classifications before settling uncertainly on possible long-range targeting instrument. And he was very still, in a way that was different from the stillness of someone who has stopped moving. This was the stillness of something that was waiting. I've seen Veth soldiers in prepared positions. I've seen Karathi ambush formations. I've seen the famous stillness of a Pelin sniper holding their breath for the moment of release. None of it looked like that. His stillness had the quality of something that had decided. I logged 0637. Human personnel deployed to positions. Behavior consistent with coordinated action, but pattern unidentified. Equipment remains unclassified. Continuing observation. I didn't log. I'm finding this unsettling, and I cannot explain why. At 0641, the short human activated the assembled device. I want to describe what it did, and I want to be precise because my report is going to be scrutinized by people who will look for anywhere I might have overstated or dramatized. So, what it did, technically, was emit a tight beam electromagnetic pulse on a very specific frequency, directed precisely at the junction point between the two Veth shield emitters where their fields overlapped, which shouldn't have done anything useful. The Veth shielding systems were hardened against electromagnetic interference. Standard spec, well documented in federated tactical databases. Any competent analyst, and the humans certainly had competent analysts, the Federated Forces aren't careless people, would have reviewed those specs and known that a pulse attack on that frequency would be absorbed by the emitter's hardening layer and dispersed harmlessly, which is what it did, for approximately 1.3 seconds. And then something in that assembled device, something I couldn't classify, something that the sensor array rendered as non-standard emission component origin. Unclear, shifted the frequency in a pattern I'd never seen in any jamming or disruption system in any database I'd access to. Not a steady shift, plus not a sweep. A pattern which irregular, non-repeating, like someone had worked out exactly which frequencies the hardening layer would struggle to route, and had designed a mission specifically to hit them in sequence, each one arriving before the system had finished responding to the last. While the overlap junction destabilized. Not fully, the shield stayed up, but the junction, that precise point where the two fields met, flickered. For 0.4 seconds, there was a gap. The human lying flat on the ground had been waiting for exactly that gap, and he put something through it. I'm going to describe what it hit as accurately as my sensors could determine, because this matters. It hit the primary power routing node for the Eastern emitter array, not the emitter itself. The routing node, a component that was technically behind the shields because it fed power to them, a component that was theoretically completely protected. The emitter didn't shut down. What it did was begin drawing power in an uncontrolled fashion, cycling through load states it wasn't rated for, which caused the shield output to pulse, expand, contract, expand, contract, in a pattern that happened to correspond to the same irregular frequency the device was still emitting. The shields began interfering with themselves. I logged at 0642, Eastern Shield Array entering anomalous cycling behavior. Cause: undetermined. Human activity may be relevant. May be relevant. I want the record to show that I said may be. My supervisor has suggested this phrasing represents a failure of analytical commitment. I maintain it was accurate to my certainty at the time. By 0643, the shield were down. The Veth garrison responded well, in the technical sense. They were trained soldiers, they had fallback positions, they had secondary weapons systems that didn't depend on the shield emitters. Their response time, from anomalous shield behavior to full garrison alert, was 38 seconds, which is within Veth standard parameters. The problem was that the 7 humans had planned for all of that. What followed wasn't a battle exactly. Or rather, it was a battle of a kind I didn't have a proper category for, which kept causing my observation log to generate incomplete entries. The Veth outnumbered the humans 13-1 in this sector. They had heavier weapons, better individual armor, and established defensive positions. By every metric my tactical training had given me for evaluating engagements, the humans shouldn't have been able to hold the field for more than 4 or 5 minutes. But the humans weren't trying to hold the field. They were trying to hold the Veth in it. The difference took me an embarrassingly long time to identify. I kept watching for the moment when the humans would fall back or push for breakthrough, because those were the 2 things you do when heavily outnumbered. You trade, in my opinion, space for time, or you punch through and run. The humans did neither, and they moved constantly, not retreating, not advancing, but shifting, forcing the Veth to track and reposition, keeping the garrison from ever consolidating into the kind of formation that would let them bring full firepower to bear. Like something pressing against the walls of a container to stop it from forming a useful shape. And the whole time, the human with the long instrument was working from his concealed position, hitting specific targets in a specific order. I eventually figured out what the order was. He was prioritizing the Veth squad coordinators, not their heavy weapons, not their armored assets, the people who told everyone else where to go. Without coordination, the Veth garrison's numbers became a liability. 90 soldiers in a confined space, without clear direction, with contacts appearing from unexpected angles. They started getting in each other's way. I logged 0651, Veth Eastern Cluster engaging in positional conflict. Human action appears, designed to induce confusion rather than achieve breakthrough. Kind of assessment. Tactics are unusual. Unusual. I use the word unusual. At 0658, the other 193 humans came through the unguarded maintenance corridors on the western flank, which had been unguarded because the Veth had pulled elements from those positions to reinforce the east when the shield anomaly triggered, and hit the main Veth command concentration from a direction that their models had marked as impassable. It was impassable by conventional transit. The humans had been working on it for 11 days. At 0701, I logged. Western breakthrough confirmed. Human forces engaging main Veth command. Eastern diversionary element withdrawing. Simulation appears to be proceeding outside model parameters. Pretty much outside model parameters. Yes, and that is one way to say it. I've approximately 400 pages of logs from the next 6 hours, and I'm not going to subject you to all of them. The summary is this. The humans turned what our analysts had called a statistically unrecoverable situation into something that, by 1300 standard, had the Veth Dominion Scareth contingent requesting evacuation authorization and destroying their own command records to prevent capture. I kept watching. I kept logging, and my coffee went cold twice, and I didn't notice either time, which is extremely unusual for me. I want that on record. What kept snagging my attention, what kept interrupting my attempts to file clean analytical observations, were the small things. The things that didn't fit the tactical picture, but that I couldn't stop noticing. The short human who'd led the Eastern diversion, when her team was pulling back, stopped to help carry a wounded soldier who wasn't from her unit. I know this to be fair because I cross-referenced identifiers. She stopped and picked up someone she didn't know and carried that person for 200 meters under intermittent fire. It added measurable time to her withdrawal. It was tactically suboptimal. She didn't appear to consider it a choice. The one who'd been eating at the start, I tracked him through the day on his identifier signature. At one point ended up temporarily isolated, cut off from his unit by a Veth flanking movement that collapsed faster than expected. He was alone for approximately 9 minutes in an area with 3 Veth patrol circuits. I watched him with something I'll clinically describe as elevated observational focus. Pretty much, he didn't freeze. He didn't panic. He did something I need to describe carefully because it sounds improbable. He waited, not hiding. There wasn't adequate cover for full concealment. He found a position that was plausibly consistent with Veth patrol staging, and he stood in it. And when the first patrol passed within 40 meters, he didn't move in any way that would trigger motion response sensors. He just stood there and in the open. Still, well, for 4 minutes. The patrol passed, and then he moved. I logged 0847. Individual human maintained stationary concealment in open position for extended period without motion-based detection. Query: is this physiologically normal for the species? Cross-referencing. The cross-reference came back. Humans have documented capacity for sustained voluntary stillness far exceeding Veth physiological norms. They also have, notably, a stress response that differs from most known species. Rather than the standard escalating physical indicators that make concealment difficult, a significant subset of human individuals under sustained threat enter a state that appears externally as calm, while internally sustaining what their own medical literature describes as massive and continuous hormonal output. They look calm when they're terrified. I logged 0849. Note for further review. Human stress response inverts standard observational heuristics. This may have implications for tactical assessment methodology. May have implications. I was being conservative. What actually I meant was every assessment model we had built on what a soldier under stress looks like was wrong. By 1300, I'd used the word unexpected 14 times in my log, which is 14 more times than I'd used it in any previous observation report. I was also aware of a persistent, low-frequency tension in my left knee that I traced eventually to the fact that I'd been tapping my log stylus against it continuously for approximately 4 hours, which isn't normal even for me. The Veth evacuation authorization came through at 1247. By 1300, the sort of last Veth units were withdrawing from Skara Station, and the humans were, I need to be accurate here, not celebrating in any way I'd expected. They weren't doing anything ceremonial. Few of them were sitting down. Some were checking each other's injuries, and the short one who'd led the Eastern diversion was talking to the wounded soldier she'd carried, who seemed to be arguing with her, and she was laughing. Not triumphantly, not with relief, and just laughing the way someone laughs when an argument is particularly absurd. I stayed to be fair, at my station for another hour after the tactical situation resolved, which isn't standard practice. I told myself I was ensuring complete observational coverage. My supervisor, reviewing my logs later, noted that this hour contained very little new tactical information and mostly consisted of close observation footage of humans doing logistically irrelevant things, eating, applying medical treatment to each other with an efficiency that I kept automatically logging as anomalous before remembering that it wasn't, sitting in small groups talking. Vaughn, my supervisor, said, in our review meeting, you understand that the observation mandate concludes at tactical resolution. I do, I said. Then, why the additional hour? I thought about this for a moment. I thought about the simulation running 412 times. I thought about the phrase statistically unrecoverable and how confident we had been, how complete that confidence had felt. I wanted, to see what they did next, I said. My supervisor looked at me for a long moment. She's 7 years of command experience and a face that gives away almost nothing. Even she, for just a second, looked like someone who had run out of the appropriate category. Write it up, she said. All of it. I did. This is the first part. Log timestamp 0314, Curl 7, 18 days after Scarith. Beginning supplemental record. Coffee, present. Sleep, not present, which my supervisor asked me in our post-Scarith debrief whether I'd any recommendations for updating our tactical assessment frameworks. Standard question. Part of every, observation review. I'd attended perhaps 40 such debriefs in my career and answered that question 40 times with some version of no substantive revisions recommended at this time. This time, I handed her a document that was 37 pages long. She TBH, read the first 8 pages, set it down, and said Vaughn. Yes, Commander. When I asked if you had recommendations, I was expecting something like perhaps recalibrate the Eastern Sensor Array. The sensor array is fine, Commander. Yes, I gathered that from the fact that your recommendations don't mention it once. I had the grace to look somewhat apologetic. The document was in retrospect a lot, but the thing about Scareth, the thing I kept coming back to in the 18 days since, in the quiet hours of the night shift when there was a thing to observe and nowhere useful to point my attention, was that we had been wrong in a way that wasn't random. We hadn't simply missed a contingency or underestimated a resource. We had, in my opinion, built our models on a set of assumptions about how sentient beings under lethal pressure behave, and those assumptions were calibrated against every species we'd studied, and the humans had violated them so consistently, so methodically, that it started to feel less like error and more like they were operating from a different set of physics. Which sounds dramatic. I'm not a dramatic person, as my supervisor will confirm. I'm, for what it's worth, a person who timestamps things. Plus, but here's what I kept coming back to. The simulation. For 100 basically, and 12 runs. In none of them did the humans win. And in none of them, not one, did they do what the humans at Scareth actually did. Not because the simulation was poorly designed, which because the simulation had been designed by people who understood how beings under extreme duress behave. The humans at Scareth hadn't behaved under duress. They behaved like they were solving a problem. A frustrating, complicated problem, with high personal stakes, but a problem. The emotional loading that should have been present in their tactical decision-making. The degradation that occurs in all known species when survival threat exceeds threshold. Either wasn't there, or it was doing something entirely different from what our models predicted. I wrote 37 pages about this. My supervisor read all of them. Eventually, she came back to me 2 weeks later and said, "There's a follow-on engagement. Different TBH, theater, different human contingent. I want you on observation." I said yes before she finished the sentence. The Kethra passage situation was, superficially, different from Scareth. Different terrain, different threat, different humans, not the Federated Response Force contingent I'd watched at Scareth, but a smaller group attached to an extraction mission that had gone sideways in ways that weren't entirely clear to me when I initially pulled the briefing. Kethra Passage was a transit route, a long, narrow channel between two significant gravitational bodies that made it useful for shipping and extremely difficult to defend on anything but a linear axis. Kind of the Veth had it. The humans needed, actually, to get a research team through it. 11 humans total for the extraction. Not soldiers, or not entirely. The, mission lead was Federated military. The rest were a mixed group, and, I'm going to be precise, 3 additional military personnel, 2 engineers, a xenobotanist, a medical specialist. 3 members of the research team being extracted, who were now technically combatants by circumstance. I've logged approximately 439 engagements in my career. I've never before had to include a xenobotanist in my tactical assessment. The briefing note on the mission lead was short. It said, Staff Sergeant Kwame Ose-Mensah, Federated Ground Forces, 7 years service. It noted his last 3 postings and gave me a physical description that I read once and didn't find especially useful. I didn't need a physical description. I needed to understand how he thought. I didn't figure that out until the 3rd hour. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. They entered the passage at 2200, which was tactically sensible. The Veth patrol pattern showed reduced coverage on the night cycle. The passage's gravitational interference disrupted long-range sensors in ways that favored concealment over distance. The extraction target was approximately 40 kilometers in, at a research station the Veth had occupied but not yet evacuated. The humans had a 12-hour window before a Veth resupply convoy would make concealment impossible. For the first 2 hours, everything went close enough to plan that I'd nothing especially interesting to log. They moved honestly, maintained spacing, used the passage's terrain intelligently. Sergeant Ose-Mensah handled them through 2 patrol circuits without contact, using route selections that I initially couldn't parse, but that I eventually mapped against the Veth patrol timing data and found to be extraordinarily precise. Hiluk was navigating not just by terrain, but by time, by where the patrols would be at a given second rather than where they had been. I logged 2247, mission lead demonstrating advanced patrol timing awareness. Assessment, well prepared, and at 2311, things stopped going to plan. The Veth had an unlogged patrol insertion. A small element, 6 soldiers, placed in the passage interior after the standard patrol timing had been established, possibly as a counter-smuggling measure, and possibly because someone on their command staff had instincts. They crossed the human route at a point that should have been clear, and the two groups were suddenly facing each other across 30 meters of narrow transit corridor with no cover, no warning, and no prepared position on either side. I want to describe the next 11 seconds carefully. The Veth froze. Plus, this is standard for a contact surprise scenario. The half-second to full-second freeze that occurs in all known species when the situation transitions from anticipated to unanticipated. It's brief, it's involuntary, and it's the window in which the side that recovers first gains a decisive positional advantage. Honestly, the humans didn't freeze. Plus, I've gone back and checked this in my logs at least 8 times. The response time from visual contact to first human action was 0.3 seconds. Not for one of them. For all 4 of the military personnel simultaneously, which suggests either that their communication system was faster than anything I'd on record for Federated forces, or that they had developed something closer to collective reflex, a shared, practiced response to this specific scenario that had been trained to the point where it didn't require conscious initiation. What they did in those 0.3 seconds wasn't what I expected. They didn't engage, and they separated, the 4 military personnel moving in 4 different directions at once, which forced the Veth element's attention to split across 4 targets without cover, while the 7 non-combatants had already gone flat in positions that the military personnel's outward movement had just cleared of potential crossfire. 11 humans moving in 11 different directions that were, nonetheless, somehow, collectively correct. But for what it's worth, contact lasted 22 seconds. At the end of it, the Veth element was neutralized, no human casualties. Sergeant Osimensa was, I guess, already moving the group forward without any apparent pause to assess what had just happened. I logged 2312. Surprise contact resolved in 22 seconds. Human response time and coordination exceed model parameters by a significant margin. Honestly, I was reviewing. I was also aware in a background processing way that my left knee had been tapping steadily since 2311 and showed no signs of stopping. The part that I've thought about most in the weeks since Kethra passage happened at hour 4, not during any firefight. The group had reached the research station and found that the 3 extraction targets were not where they were supposed to be. The station had a subterranean level that hadn't appeared on the mission maps. Old construction, possibly pre-Veth. The extraction targets had retreated there when the Veth arrived and hadn't been able to communicate their position. Finding them took 40 minutes, and not because the search was difficult, the station wasn't large, but because the subterranean level had one access point. It was compromised, and getting to it required going through a portion of the station that the Veth were actively using as a temporary logistics depot. I'm going to describe what Sergeant Osimensa did, and I'm going to do it plainly because every time I try to add context, it sounds like I'm embellishing. He went, in my opinion, in himself, alone, left his team in concealment. Spent 20, minutes in a logistics depot full of Veth soldiers, moving between the equipment stores, the parked vehicles, the resting personnel, and he did isn't by sneaking in the technical sense of moving quickly through concealed routes, but by moving in a way that looked like he was supposed to be there. He walked like someone doing a job. He paused to examine equipment the way someone does when checking inventory. When a Veth soldier looked at him directly, I've this on sensor footage, the soldier was within 5 meters and had full visual. Osimensa didn't react. He, in my opinion, glanced up from what he was examining, gave a slight nod of acknowledgement, and went back to the equipment. The Veth soldier moved on. Osimensa reached the access point, cleared the obstruction in a way that was genuinely quiet, made contact with the extraction targets, and was back out with all 3 of them in 23 minutes. Moving through the same depot, in the same way, this time with 3 exhausted researchers who had clearly been given extremely specific instructions about how to move because they matched his cadence and his bearing, and none of them looked like people who were terrified, even though 2 of them demonstrably were. I could see it in their biometric signatures because Osimensa was moving like someone who wasn't, and they were following his lead, and apparently that was sufficient. I logged 0021. Mission lead and 3 extraction targets transited active VETH position without incident. Methodology, behavioral camouflage, plus assessment. I stopped, deleted the assessment field, started again, and assessment. I don't have a category for this. They made it out. All TBH, 11 of them, plus the 3 extraction targets, 14 total, which meant nobody was lost in transit, which my pre-mission analysis had given a 23% probability of achieving. I'm not going well to pretend the math worked out because the humans were somehow invincible. They weren't. At hour 6, one of the engineers, a human named Ferreira, who had been cheerfully and inappropriately chatty on the team communications channel for the entire operation, and who I'd been finding somehow distracting in a way I couldn't properly categorize, got hit by a burst weapon discharge that clipped her left side and put her down. She was back up in 4 minutes. I know the injury was real because the biometrics don't lie, and because I watched it happen. I know 4 minutes is an absurdly short time to be incapacitated by that type of wound because I cross-referenced it with 11 different medical databases. The TBH consensus was minimum expected incapacitation for that severity, that location, was 40 to 60 minutes. Ferreira was up in 4. She was moving, I guess. In 6, she was complaining about something on the communications channel by 8, in a tone that made it completely impossible to determine whether she was talking about her injury or the terrain, and I eventually concluded she was talking about both simultaneously. Sergeant Oseminsa said on the channel, in the most completely tonally neutral voice I've ever heard of being used, "You're fine." Ferreira said, I know. Did I say I wasn't fine? You have an expression. I always have an expression. Not that one. There was a pause. Then Ferreira said, it's a good expression and very motivational. I logged this exchange verbatim. I'm not sure why. It wasn't tactically relevant, which my supervisor, in review, noted its presence in my log with what I interpreted as mild professional puzzlement. I told her I'd included it for completeness. She accepted this, and I think the real reason is that it was the moment I stopped thinking of them as a unit and started thinking of them as specific people, which isn't standard observational protocol, but which I've not been able to reverse since. The debrief for Kethra Passage ran 6 hours, which is twice the standard length. The additional 3 hours were spent almost entirely on 2 questions. The first was about the 0.3 second collective response time during the surprise contact. Our analysts wanted to know if the humans had some communication system we hadn't detected. The answer, based on everything we could determine, was no. What they had was practice, the same practice to reflex collective response I'd noted at Scarith, which suggested this wasn't specific to those individuals, but was something being deliberately trained across Federated ground forces. I put this in my report and flagged it with 3 separate priority indicators. My supervisor read that section twice. I could tell by her eyes. She's a specific way of rereading something, a small pause, a reset of position. And she did it twice, which means something in what I wrote needed to be read more than once to fully process. Good. Well, that was intentional. The second question was about the behavioral camouflage. What Oseminsa had done in the VETH Logistics Depot. Our analysts kept trying to put it in an existing category. They went through disguise operations, infiltration methodology, social engineering protocols, and nothing fit cleanly because what Oseminsa had done wasn't exactly any of those things. He had not pretended to be VETH. Plus, he hadn't imitated their mannerisms or their uniform. He had simply moved like someone who belonged in the space and then waited for the VETH's pattern recognition systems, both automated and biological, to fill in the rest. He had, in a sense, made himself into a blank and let the VETH paint whatever meaning on him was most convenient. One of our analysts suggested that this required a level of psychological control, of suppressing fear response, of forcing external presentation to decouple from internal state that would be difficult to train and extraordinarily difficult to sustain. I noted that humans consistently showed external calm under conditions that would produce observable stress responses in any other species we documented. The analyst said, honestly, how do they do that? I said I didn't know. I still don't. I have a theory, which my theory is that they've been doing this for so long, living with threat as a baseline condition rather than exception, that the external calm isn't suppression at all. It's just, well, what they look like. The internal state, may be identical to any other frightened species. The face simply doesn't know how to show it the same way. I didn't include this theory in my official report. It doesn't have enough evidential support, but I've been thinking about it at 0314 in the morning, which is where this log started, and the reason I keep coming back to it's this. If I'm right, if the external comm isn't performance, but baseline, then what we've been reading as composure is actually something closer to a species-level adaptation. Not that they're braver than other species, not that they feel less, but that something somewhere in their history required them to function completely while feeling everything for long enough that the functioning and the feeling became separate systems. Separate, plus not suppressed. Separate. Oseminsa, walking through that depot, not afraid. Walking anyway. The distinction matters. I'm not sure I can explain why yet, but I've written it here, time-stamped and logged at 0314, so I can find it later when I'm less tired and the coffee is warm. And supplemental record. 0314. Kethra passage follow-up debrief complete. Coffee cold. Furtanumans extracta. Theory pending. Query from Scareth. Is this normal for the species? Running revision. The question may be wrong. Which new query? What does normal even mean for a species that's separated functioning from feeling? Flagging for further review. Log timestamp 1152, curl 7, 41 days after Scareth. Request for extended observational deployment. Approved. Personal note to file. I need better coffee. What they send to forward stations is an insult to the concept of beverage. There is a period between Kethra passage and what happened at Veth Relay Station Oscar, where I was assigned. To routine monitoring, cargo traffic, diplomatic courier logs, the kind of observation that requires presence, but very little thought. I did it methodically. I time-stamped everything. I drank the terrible coffee, and I waited, and I thought about the theory I'd written at 0314 and hadn't put in any official report. At day 31 of the routine monitoring, I got a new assignment briefing, and I recognized one of the identifier signatures in the personnel manifest. Sergeant Ose Minsa, which Kethra passage. The man who'd kind of walked through a Veth depot like he owned it. Attached to a 3-person advance element. Mission, reach Relay Station Oscar, disable the Veth long-range communications array, and get out before the Dominion could lock down the passage approaches. 3 people. To an active Veth Relay Station. I logged. Day 31, new assignment. Personnel familiar. To be fair, mission parameters. Aggressive. I finished the terrible coffee. I prepared a fresh cup of terrible coffee. I began observational setup, which the third person is who I want to tell you about. I'd Ose Minsa's profile. The profile of the second team member, a demolition specialist named Volkov, whose file contained a note that said high initiative, brief supervisor review recommended in the kind of bureaucratic language that means this person has strong opinions and limited patience for being told no. I filed them both and flagged the potential for interpersonal friction within the unit, which is standard practice. The third profile was a woman named Adeyemi. Her file listed her specialization as signals intelligence, which made tactical sense for a communications disruption mission. Her service record was shorter than the other two. There was a sort of note about previous action near the Kethra transit system, which I cross-referenced without finding anything. INT already observed. Nothing in her file prepared me for the first hour. In the first hour, Adeyemi found 3 separate Veth sensor arrays that were not in any intelligence briefing the humans had received, identified all 3 without specialist equipment, and rerouted the team's approach path to avoid all of them without disrupting their timeline by more than 6 minutes. I logged. Hour 1. Element 3 conducting independent sensor survey. Success rate 100%. Method unclear. Then I watched the sensor footage more carefully and figured out what she was doing. She was watching sort of the birds. I need to explain what I mean by this because Relay Station Oscar isn't a planet. It doesn't have birds. What any large pressurized station with ventilation systems and heat differentials and dust has is particulate movement patterns. Tiny, invisible to the naked eye like patterns in the way dust and gas currents behave when a sensor array is drawing power nearby. The thermal signature, the electrical interference, the minute variations in airflow. Adeyemi was reading them, not with instruments, with her eyes. With whatever calculation was happening in her head as she moved through the corridor, pausing at certain junctions, tilting her head at angles I initially read as disorientation and eventually recognized as precision. She was essentially, honestly, navigating by the station's breath. I called this out of my log and then immediately second-guessed it because it sounded like the kind of observation that gets a reviewer to question whether the observer needs a rest rotation. But I stood by it. I went back through the footage, cross-referenced the points where she paused with the locations of the sensor arrays she identified, and the correlation was unambiguous. She was reading environmental data that was technically there to be read. The arrays weren't invisible. Nothing is invisible to a thorough enough scan. What was unusual, what I couldn't explain, was that she wasn't doing a thorough scan. She was doing a glance. A practiced, comprehensive, near-instantaneous environmental read that achieved the same result as a full sensor sweep in the time it took her to look up at a ventilation junction. I put a note in my log, Adeyemi, specialist. Environmental intuition beyond documented human sensory norms. Query, training? Or something else? I don't have an answer. I'm flagging it because it matters. Volkov was the one who caused my first real problem of the mission, at hour 2, when he did something that my threat assessment protocols identified as a probable mission-terminating error. He stopped. Plus, not in a tactically defensible position. Not in cover. He stopped in an open transit corridor, 30 meters from an active VETH patrol circuit, and crouched down to look at something on the deck plating. I flagged it immediately. Increased resolution. Prepared a tactical impact note. He was looking at a stain on the corridor floor. A dark mark, irregular, that had the unmistakable characteristic profile of organic material under forensic imaging. Sort of someone had died there. Recently. The mark was approximately 3 days old by the degradation profile. Volkov looked at it for about 4 seconds. Then he took something from a small pouch on his gear. I couldn't get a visual identification. The object was too small, and placed it on the floor next to the mark. He stood up and moved on. He never mentioned it on the communications channel. He didn't tell Osei Minsa or Adeyemi. He fell, sort of, back into formation, and the mission continued. I kept the footage. I've looked at the small object a dozen times through every sensor enhancement I've access to. It's a, flat piece of material, possibly fabricated, with markings that I cannot identify as federated military iconography. Personal item, and possibly a memorial marker of some kind. The basically kind of thing you place at a site where someone died, which is a practice documented in several species, but which I'd not specifically observed humans doing in active operational conditions before. He placed it in a hostile station during a mission with narrow margins. While 30 meters from a patrol, he couldn't fully observe for someone he probably didn't know because they were dead, and the floor was unmarked, and apparently that wasn't acceptable to him. No tactical value. He didn't slow down by more than 8 seconds. I didn't log this as an anomaly. I logged it as an observation, and I'm including it here because it keeps sitting in my memory in a way that anomalies don't. Anomalies you resolve. You find, the explanation, and you file it, and you move on. This one I keep returning to, and I'm not sure what I'm looking for when I go back to it. Maybe I'm looking for the right word for what he did. I've been through, my vocabulary twice, and I don't have one that fits properly. I know what the action was. A memorial gesture, a marker of acknowledgement, a refusal to let the dead be completely unmarked. But the word I keep reaching for isn't any of those things. It's something about the combination of the 8 seconds, and the hostile corridor, and the 30-meter patrol circuit, and the flat piece of personal material placed quietly on the floor. Something to be fair about the fact that he didn't stop being operational while he did it. They reached the communications array at hour 3. The array occupied a large technical space near the station's core, with 3 VETH technicians and a 6-person security element. Standard configuration for a relay installation of this size. What wasn't standard was that the VETH had, in the previous 24 hours, installed an additional hardened encryption layer that wasn't in any intelligence briefing, and that Adeyemi identified approximately 11 minutes before the team would have reached the array perimeter, which was exactly 11 minutes more warning than they'd have had otherwise. The team stopped. I watched them confer on the comms channel in the abbreviated, incomplete sentences of people who have worked together long enough to not need full sentences. Osei Minsa, how long to crack it? Adeyemi, depends on the architecture. 3 hours if it's standard hardening. Could be 6 if they built it themselves. Volkov, we have 90 minutes. A pause. Then, Adeyemi, I can try something else. Oseminsa, define try. It might work. Might. 60%. Another pause. I heard Volkov do something with his breath. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. Somewhere between them. He said, 60 is better than 0. Oseminsa, do it. What Adeyemi did for the next 40 minutes, I'm going to describe to the best of my observational capability, with the caveat that my signals intelligence background isn't deep enough to fully characterize what I watched. She didn't try to crack the encryption, which she worked around it. What she did, and I've had 3 separate analysts review my footage since, and the consensus is that she essentially improvised a protocol that doesn't exist in any documented system. Was use the encryption layer's own verification handshake signals as a carrier for a degradation algorithm. She convinced the system that it was talking to itself. And while it was doing that, she slipped the disruption through in the gap between the verification pulse and the acknowledgement. It's a technique that, as far as anyone I've spoken to can determine, doesn't have a name. One of the analysts I consulted said, with the specific tone of someone choosing words carefully, this appears to have been invented on-site in approximately 40 minutes with standard issue equipment, under time pressure. I said, yes. The analyst said, that's not how encryption works. I said, I know. The analyst said, I mean, you can't just, the architecture alone would require, and then stopped. And I watched her do the same thing I'd done at Scareth when the simulation ran out of categories. She picked up, a stylus and tapped it against the desk. Basically, I recognized the movement. I didn't say anything. I let her honestly sit with it and write it up, she said eventually. I'm writing it up, and the array went down at hour 3, minute 47. Clean disruption, no physical breach required, no contact with the VETH security element. The 3 technicians in the array room had equipment failures they couldn't explain. The security element started investigating what they assumed was a power fault. By the time anyone formulated the right question about an active intrusion, the 3 humans were already in the exfil corridor. They made it to extraction at hour 4, minute 12. Within the window, which clean. I should have logged it as clean and moved on to post-mission analysis. What I actually did was stay at my station for 2 hours after the mission closed, reviewing footage of specific moments I couldn't stop returning to. Adeyemi tilting her head at the ventilation junction. Volkov placing the small object on the floor. Oseminsa in the depot at Kethera, moving like someone who belonged there. The short human at Scareth, carrying a stranger 200 meters under fire. The one who'd stood still in the open for 4 minutes while a patrol circuit passed. I've been an observer for 6 years. I have a complete and coherent system for categorizing and analyzing what I observe. I have, frameworks for tactical assessment, for behavioral prediction, for individual and unit performance modeling. These frameworks exist because they work. Because the universe, in my experience, is sufficiently consistent that what has happened before provides meaningful guidance for what will happen next. The humans keep breaking the guidance, which not in random ways. Not in ways that suggest I'm missing data. In ways that suggest the data I was fine, but that I've been applying the wrong framework. I keep coming back to something a senior analyst said at the Scareth review, which I'm going to quote exactly because I wrote it down immediately. The problem with assessing human forces is that their threat models assume consequences they've apparently chosen to treat as acceptable. She meant it as a criticism of their strategic planning. A rationality failure. When the consequences of your actions include death, and your threat model accepts death as an outcome rather than a terminal boundary condition, your decision tree has paths that no other species would take. But sitting here at 11:52, 41 days out from Scareth, with the footage of Kethera and Oscar and everything in between, I keep turning that statement around and looking at it from the other direction. What if it's not a rationality failure? What if accepting death as an outcome, as a possible conclusion rather than an absolute boundary, actually frees the decision tree? What if, for what it's worth, being that has genuinely, functionally processed the concept of its own death as a real, acceptable possibility operates differently from one that's, at some fundamental level, still trying to avoid that outcome at all costs? Not because they don't value survival. They clearly do. The extraction methodology, the precision of Adeyemi's work, the care with which Osemensa, I think, kept his team alive. These aren't the actions of beings who are careless with survival. But they treat death the way we treat a difficult constraint, not the way we treat a wall. We hit the wall. Plus, we stop. They treat the constraint as one of several factors in the problem. I don't know what to do with this observation. I'm not, sure it belongs in a standard report. But I keep writing it down in my personal log because I've a feeling. I'm not generally a feelings-based analyst. I want to be clear about that it's important. That understanding how humans process this specific thing is more important than anything else I've documented in 6 years of observation. I want to be very clear about that. This is honestly a personal log filed under personal record designation, time-stamped for my own reference. It, I guess, does not represent the position of the Scareth Observation Corps, the Federated Monitoring Authority, or my supervisor, who would describe what I'm about to write as extrapolating beyond evidential mandate, and who would be technically correct. I'm writing it anyway. The Veth Dominion, in the 67 days since Scareth Station, has lost 4 engagements where their forces outnumbered the opposing human contingent by a ratio of no less than 4 to 1. I've personally observed 2 of those engagements. I've reviewed the sensor footage of the other 2. In none of them did the humans win because they were stronger. In none of them did they win because they were better armed, better supplied, or operating with superior intelligence. They won because they were willing to do things the Veth weren't willing to do. Things that the Veth's own internal models couldn't generate as possible options, because the Veth's models, like our models, are built on the assumption that self-preservation functions as a hard boundary for all rational actors. The humans don't have that boundary in the same place. I spent 67 days trying to phrase this in a way that's analytically defensible. Doesn't sound like the field notes of someone who has been observing the same species for too long and started going strange. I've written 4 drafts of a formal paper. I've deleted all 4. The problem is the problem itself. The humans haven't done anything irrational. That's what I keep having to explain, and it's the thing that's hardest to convey, because when you describe a 3-person team disrupting a hardened relay station with on-site invented methodology, it sounds like a story about cleverness or courage. When you describe a single soldier standing still in an open corridor for 4 minutes while a patrol passes, it sounds like a story about nerve. It's not. Plus, it's a story about the gap. The specific structural gap between what a species does when it accepts death and what it does when it's still, at the base level, trying not to die. The Veth are trying not to die, which they're good at it. Their tactical doctrine, their formations, their withdrawal thresholds, all of it's optimized for keeping their soldiers alive, and their engagements cost-effective. When the cost-effectiveness calculation breaks down, they pull back. They request reinforcement. Plus, they sort of fall back to defensible positions and wait for odds that favor them. The humans run the calculation and sometimes decide that the cost-effectiveness breakpoint is acceptable. Not because they've given up, because they've decided the objective is worth the math. This is the thing I couldn't put in my official report, because it sounds like I'm saying humans are suicidal or reckless, and they're not. Ferreira, hit in the corridor at Kethra, was back in 4 minutes because she'd been injured before, and she'd trained for it, and she knew precisely what her body could do under those conditions. Osemensa walked through that depot not because he was brave in the undefined sense, but because he had practiced that specific kind of invisibility until it was reliable. Adeyemi invented the protocol at Oscar because she had the underlying framework. She just hadn't put it together in that configuration before. The capability is real. The risk is assessed, and the humans aren't throwing themselves at walls randomly. They've just decided that a wall you can get through, even at cost, isn't the same as a wall you can't. There's one more thing Ivan T put in any official record. I'm putting it here. At Scareth, the day after the engagement, I was still on extended observational coverage. By that point, it was clearly beyond my mandate, and my supervisor had sent 3 increasingly pointed messages, all of which I'd logged and not acted on. I was watching the humans because I couldn't stop. They had set up a temporary consolidated position in the processing core, while Federated Command arranged exfil transport. The actually wounded were being treated. The dead, there were 11, I had the count precisely, were laid out in a specific area. That the surviving soldiers had cordoned off Not with equipment or tactical barriers, but with themselves, standing in a loose perimeter that had no defensive value whatsoever, facing inward. Facing the dead. They did this for an extended period. Not in silence. There was quiet conversation. Periodically, someone would speak at a slightly higher register that my audio processing categorized as formal or ceremonial tone. I don't have the translation of what was said, and I'm not sure a translation would have helped me understand it. The content wasn't the point, and the point was that 219 surviving soldiers had, as a collective and apparently spontaneous decision, stopped operational activity to stand with their dead. In the middle of an active theater, with Veth remnant elements still unaccounted for in the outer corridors. With extraction, kind of transport still 6 hours out. They made themselves tactically vulnerable to mourn. I logged it as Federated Contingent engaged in post-combat memorial activity. Duration, 2.3 hours. Tactical assessment, accepted vulnerability window, and no hostile contact during this period. My supervisor, reviewing this entry, asked me why I'd included a tactical assessment of a memorial ceremony. I told her it was standard practice to note accepted vulnerability windows. She said, yes, for combat operations, not for, and she stopped and looked at the entry again. They really stood there for 2 hours? 2 hours, 17 minutes. With Veth remnants unaccounted for. Yes. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, did anything happen? No contact. Were the remnants still in the outer corridors? 2 elements confirmed. Neither approached. A longer pause. My supervisor has a very good face for difficult information. She looked at this entry for a while. Write it up, she said. I'd written it up, which I just didn't know what section to put it in. I put here instead. The thing about the simulation running 412 times is that I've been thinking about it differently lately. Our analysts ran it 412 times to find the conditions under which the humans could win. They never found those conditions. They concluded the humans couldn't win. What they never tested was the conditions under which the humans would stop. That question didn't exist in the simulation. It didn't exist in the simulation because for every other species in our database, those conditions are known quantities. There's a casualty threshold, a resource threshold, a time threshold. Every rational actor has a point at which the calculation resolves to withdrawal or surrender. The simulation assumed the humans had that threshold. I've now watched 67 days of engagements across 4 combat situations, and I've not been able to find it. I want to be precise. I don't mean the humans haven't reached it. I mean I can't locate where it's. I can't find the parameter in their decision-making that corresponds to the threshold function. I've looked for it in casualty response, in resource depletion curves, in command communication patterns when pressure escalates. The threshold isn't where I expect it. It isn't, I think, where it's supposed to be. There are 2 sort of possible explanations. The first is that Ivan T. observed the right conditions yet. The threshold exists. I just haven't seen it triggered. This is scientifically sound. I don't have enough data to rule it out. The second explanation is the one I wrote at 0314 41 days ago and haven't been able to unwrite since. The second explanation is that the threshold functions differently for humans. Not absent. I mean different. Plus, not located at the point where survival is threatened, but at a different point entirely when Ivan T. fully mapped yet that seems to be related to something other than individual survival calculus. I think the threshold is relational. I think what for what it's worth triggers human withdrawal or surrender isn't personal danger or resource depletion, but something that happens in the space between them. When the goal fails to serve the people it was supposed to serve. When continuing means losing what continuation was for. I can't prove this. I've fragmentary evidence across 4 engagement scenarios and a theory that I wrote at 0314 in terrible coffee and uncertain lighting and that I've been unable to disprove. But I keep coming back to Scareth. To 219 soldiers standing with their dead for 2 hours in a tactically indefensible position. The Veth remnants were in the outer corridors. They didn't approach. Plus, I've been thinking about why. The Veth aren't cowardly. They're not irrational. They made a tactical assessment. A force of 219 soldiers in an established position isn't a viable target for 2 remnant elements. Standard doctrine would confirm the assessment. But they couldn't, I guess, have known from the outer corridors that the humans had made themselves vulnerable. They couldn't have seen the position clearly enough to assess it. What they'd have seen, what their sensors would have shown, was a large human force, consolidated, stationary, apparently at rest. Apparently unworried about the outer corridors. Apparently not afraid, which from a Veth tactical perspective would suggest that the humans knew something the remnants didn't. That there was a reason for that stillness. That moving well toward it would be moving toward a prepared engagement, not an unprepared one. The humans were vulnerable, and they looked like they weren't, not because they were trying to look that way, but because they were doing something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with the outer corridors, and the incidental effect of that was that they appeared confident. Appeared like a force that had won, and knew it, and wasn't concerned about what came next. Well, the Veth held, called for extraction, left. 219 humans spent 2 hours with their 11 dead, and none of the Veth remnants fired a shot. I filed a formal paper, eventually version 5. To be fair, my supervisor reviewed it. She approved it for distribution to the Federated Monitoring Authority with 17 editorial notes, 15 of which were phrasing adjustments, and 2 of which said, essentially, you cannot include this without more evidence, Vaughn. I took out the section she flagged. The approved version is 14 pages, which it says the humans are more effective than modeled, identifies specific areas where assessment frameworks need recalibration, and recommends extended observational deployment. It does not say what I've written here. It does not say. I think we've been asking the wrong question from the beginning. We've been asking how humans fight. We've been mapping their tactics, their response times, their improvisation capability, their pain tolerance, their coordination under pressure. We should have been asking what they're fighting for. Because TBH, the tactics are remarkable, and the response times are worth documenting, and the improvisation at Oscar genuinely required 3 analysts and several days to fully characterize. These things are real. Plus, these things matter. But they're not what stopped the Veth at Scarith. What stopped the Veth at Scarith was 219 people who had just survived something terrible, standing with their dead in the middle of an active theater, unhurried and apparently at peace, in a way that no tactical logic could fully account for, and in a way that the Veth's pattern recognition read as confidence, read as control, read as a force that had not been broken, which was accurate, as far as it went. The Veth read it as, they weren't afraid. What actually was, they were afraid, and they were also here standing with people they'd lost doing what needed to, be done, and the fear was just one of many things present in the same space. That distinction, that impossible, apparently irrational, operationally irrelevant distinction, it saved 219 lives. Basically, I'm still at curl 7. My opinion, extension has been approved through the end of the cycle, which gives me approximately 90 more days. My supervisor has requested I produce a summary framework for the updated assessment methodology by day 60. I've started drafting it. It's 15 pages and growing. I've good timestamps on everything. The coffee remains terrible. I ran the simulation last night. Not the official one, just the internal model I've been building privately across 4 engagements, incorporating everything I've seen. I ran it for the scare scenario. Changed the variables the original simulation hadn't accounted for. The threshold function, the relational calculus, the external comm that tests in suppression. I let it run. It found conditions under which the humans could win. Not every time, not without cost, but the conditions exist, and the original simulation found none. I've been thinking well about what that means, about the actually 412 runs that didn't find it, about the confidence side, that morning, reading the phrase statistically unrecoverable over my first good coffee of the day. I'm not ready to write a conclusion. I want to be clear about that. I'm an observer. Plus, I document. I timestamp. I flag queries for further review. So I'll end this the same way I've ended every entry in this personal log. Query open. I guess. Flag for further review. The humans at Scarith won, and the simulation said they couldn't. The simulation was built by people who understood exactly how sentient beings under lethal pressure behave. One pretty much of those things is wrong.